The RTX 4080 released for $1,200, and it is still one of the fastest graphics cards in the world. But what if I told you this $600 GPU right here is supposed to get the same FPS? And apparently it even beats the 4080 in multiple games. I didn't believe it either, so that's why I bought both. And today we're uncovering the truth. Can it really compete? What did they have to sacrifice to get this performance for $600? And would I actually recommend it over the 4080? But most importantly, what even is this GPU? Well, this is the RX 9070 XT, released just 6 months ago at an MSRP of $599. But with heavy emphasis on MSRP because AMD never actually made a reference model, and the cheapest one I can currently find is actually sitting at 899 Canadian dollars, equivalent to 651 US dollars, which is 8% more than it should be. But when you see just how powerful it is from the benchmarks later in this video, I think we can easily look past the 8% price increase. What we can't simply look past though is the competition it's up against, because the RTX 4080 is definitely not a joke. So the 9070 XT has to have some seriously impressive specs for the price to compete with it. And luckily, it absolutely does. 4,096 cores with a boost clock of 2.97 GHz, and 16 GB of VRAM to match the 4080. But because the 9070 XT is an AMD graphics card, you might expect it to be bad for ray tracing, encoding, and all the other features Nvidia offers in their graphics cards. And to be honest, I thought the same when the 9070 XT came out half a year ago, because this isn't the first time that AMD went head to head with the 4080. You might remember that when the 4080 first released in November of 2022, AMD dropped the RX 7900 XTX as a response 1 month later. It had more VRAM and was even slightly faster in raw performance at around the same price point. So why did I and many others still choose Nvidia in this situation? Well, that was because AMD was lacking severely in ray tracing, upscaling quality, and aspects where Nvidia was objectively dominating at the time. Fast forward to 2025 though, and it looks like AMD might actually have an answer to the 4080 that doesn't sacrifice all those features. But that brings up the real question we need to answer about the 9070 XT. It's not just can it match the 4080's FPS, but can a Radeon GPU now deliver that 4080 level experience at half the price without having to sacrifice all the things that make a high-end GPU feel high-end? And this is where it gets even more interesting. While the 9070 XT's real price is $650, the used market has changed the game completely. You can now find both of its competitors for around $750. So with this new context, is the 9070 XT still the move, or are you better off spending an extra $100 on a used previous gen graphics card? To find out, we're putting both GPUs against each other in competitive games and ray tracing at 1440p, starting with the pure rasterization performance. This is where AMD should have the advantage, and if it doesn't win here, then it has no chance in the ray tracing or productivity benchmarks. Starting with Monster Hunter Wilds, the 9070 XT already takes the lead with 100 FPS over the RTX 4080's 98. But here's the catch. That was actually with ray tracing on high, and the 9070 XT was still able to pull ahead. I even did these benchmarks multiple times, and no matter what, the 4080 just could not catch up. Sure, it's just about the smallest lead you can possibly have, but it is still incredible what AMD has been able to do with their newest generation of GPUs. But that isn't just a one-off for the 9070 XT, because even in Cyberpunk 2077, it is still able to keep up when it comes to ray tracing. Using the Ray Tracing Ultra preset, it's only 4 FPS behind the RTX 4080, and only really falls behind in path tracing. But all of this is to be expected. What is completely unexpected though, is the power consumption on the 9070 XT. It is absolutely ridiculous that it ever even reaches 450 watts, and on average it's consuming between 50 to 70 more watts than the 4080 to produce about the same amount of frames. Now this doesn't necessarily mean that the card is inefficient, because we are comparing it to one of the most efficient graphics cards ever produced, but again, spiking over 400 watts of power usage multiple times was not something I expected at all. Not once have I ever seen a GPU use this much power in my entire life. This is approaching 4090, 5090 levels of power consumption. You can of course undervolt the 9070 XT to help against this insane power usage and increase performance, but for the sake of keeping this comparison as fair as possible, I have left it on stock settings. At the same time though, this brings up one of the most impressive aspects about this graphics card, because even though it's pulling over 300 watts of power pretty much at all times, it is also remaining below 60 degrees at all times. And let me remind you, this is a 2-slot graphics card. It is substantially smaller than this RTX 4080. yet it runs cooler while pulling more power. I'm not complaining though, that's actually a good thing. But unfortunately, things only get worse for the 9070 XT in Shadow of the Tomb Raider. In this game, we're getting 160 FPS compared to the RTX 4080's 174. However, if you take a look at the GPU bound percentage, it is much higher on the 9070 XT. This means that 98% of the time, the FPS is being bottlenecked by the GPU. Whereas on the 4080, it's only 86% of the time, so we would be getting an even higher number with the 4080 if I had a better CPU. And that continues to be the case as the 4080 continues to get higher FPS in all of the older games I tested in this video. So it seems like AMD is really starting to fall behind. But that is definitely not the case in newer Unreal Engine 5 titles such as Black Myth Wukong. In this game, the 9070 XT gets 125 FPS compared to Nvidia's 132. It is still very close, and they're both extremely playable, but it is important to note that the 9070 XT does not necessarily beat the 4080. In Marvel Rivals at competitive settings, it becomes a lot more CPU intensive, so the results don't really matter as much, but the 9070 XT still does come out on top. That is, until you enable Nvidia Reflex. When I turn on Reflex on the 4080, it actually improves our frames and boosts them up to 180, whereas AMD's alternative for Reflex actually decreases our frames by 4%. And the same trend continues in Fragpunk. As you'll see, we lose 12% of our frames just by enabling this technology. Of course, this isn't something that most people really worry about, and a ton of pro players don't even use anti-lag or reflex. But I thought that I'd point it out anyways because it's strange to see that anti-lag will often reduce your performance while reflex somehow improves it. I don't really know, it's just weird. That brings us to my final thoughts on the RX 9070 XT. Do I think it's worth picking up? 100%. But is it the best option? If you asked me that question when it first released 6 months ago, my answer would have been a definite yes. Compared to Nvidia's direct competition at the time, a used 4080 was going for upwards of $900 US, while the similar performing 5070 Ti was being price gouged all the way up to $1,000 and beyond. And this card right here was also nowhere near MSRP. But today, prices are looking much more competitive, and you can easily find the newest 5070 Ti and previous gen 4080 and 7900 XTX for about $700 to $800 each. However, with all those still being $100 more to this day, the 9070 XT is still in a very good spot. But honestly, they are all very good for their own reasons. Cause if you're considering the 9070 XT and want the most possible performance, the 7900 XTX is a fair bit faster and the most capable at 4K out of these 4 GPUs. And having 24 gigabytes of VRAM makes it the most future-proof of the bunch. But you should know that it is the slowest when it comes to ray tracing. On the other hand, the 5070 Ti being the newest Nvidia GPU in the conversation makes it a great purchase at $750 as well. While it doesn't quite have the raw performance of the XTX or 4080, it offers DLSS 4 and longer driver support. And then sitting right in the middle, you've got the RTX 4080. It's still a really solid card and it does hold its own in productivity, but at this point it's last gen architecture. And for the same money, I just don't think it makes as much sense as the newer 5070 Ti or the cheaper 9070 XT. So those were my thoughts on AMD's latest GPU, but if you want to see how the $500 GPU that's supposed to kill the RTX 4090 stacks up, watch this video next.